Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm George Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum, and as always, I'm excited to be here with you all today. In today's episode, I'm going to be covering the topic of retrieval. What is it? Should we care about it? And are there abuses or reasons that we should not do it? Before we jump into the episode, remember to like the video if you enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, and then do comment if you agree, disagree, or have any other ideas and thoughts. And as always, I don't remember if I always remind you all of this, but you can go to our website, thelondonlyceum.com/kiffins-keep, and you can drop me questions there or messages, or you can find out some more about the show. So let's go ahead and jump in right away. Before we move into the reason for this episode, the idea of it coming up forth, other than just I'm passionate about retrieval and I think it matters and it's important, I want to give a little bit of baseline work on what is retrieval. So for me, when I think about retrieval, particularly as it relates to theology, so it would be theological retrieval. It is a sort of careful, it's a project, a research program of careful historical research that reappropriates the insights from the past that we've gleaned in the past for a modern context. That's all it is. And so there is, in a large sense, this is a sort of receptive posture to theologizing as fundamentally given rather than generative. Now, there is generative aspects to the theology of retrieval, because if there weren't, you would be doing basically a theology of repersonation. You'd find some golden era, some period where everything was right, and you would just take wholesale, just kind of pick this up and drop it off wherever you're at. But I don't think that's realistic or helpful. I think that's ultimately those sort of theological programs are diseased, because you got to think about, how does this fit my own context? Not in a way that you're revising, but you're appropriately doing sort of the development of doctrine, as John Henry Newman would famously say. So as you think about theology of retrieval, it's just the realization that the content of theology is not a singular moment of grace. There's not just one moment of grace and we're all trying to get back there. There's this entire context of theology that's marked by grace in the past, in the current moment, and in the future, where we're constantly receiving from the Lord every good thing as we develop and learn and grow in all the goodness and knowledge of God. So I like this quote from a Baptist theologian and pastor, John Collett Ryland, who said this. He explains theology as, quote, marked by its religious responsibility to God as an act of worshipful gratitude. What follows for theology is not further divinely inspired teaching, but rather hearing, receptivity, and confession of that which has been given once for all, as in Jude 3, end quote. I think that's a nice sort of summative way of what theology of retrieval is. There's good news in the past, things we've learned, and we want to take those, receive those, and confess them in our own context today. So when we think of theology of retrieval, it's this practice and this idea that the end goal of hearing from the Christian tradition is not simply one of restoration or repersonation or even complete revolution. There is this idea that there is a end goal of a serious and creative usage of the past for the present. And that's really, at least in my mind, sort of the whole idea of what retrieval is. I talk more about this in a forthcoming book that I have called Classical Theism, A Christian Introduction, from Lexham Press. That will be available at some point after this video comes out. So maybe if you're watching this later, you can go get a copy of that book. Another nice intermediate, sort of maybe a little bit lower, but thinking a nice undergraduate text to think more about retrieval will be, I think Gavin Ortland has one where I don't remember the title of it. Something about evangelicals and retrieval. I mean, if you Google his name or put it in Amazon, you'll find it. Those are nice little entryways into thinking about what retrieval is, why it matters. Now, as far as why should you care about retrieval or do retrieval, there's a couple of points. I could go on and do a whole video on explaining why retrieval is important, why it's valuable, why it's necessary. But I'm just going to give you 3 points here, and we'll stick with those. And you can comment if you think I missed anything that you think, wow, I can't believe he didn't talk about this in his top 3. So the top 3 things for me would be, number 1, because Hebrews 13 tells us to honor our fathers in the faith and imitate their way of life. And fundamentally, I think retrieval, that's what it's about. That's what it's doing. It's imitating the way of life of the fathers of the faith. It's looking to them and their pattern and their thought process and trying to take them and use it for today. Number 2, And I guess number one, along with Hebrews 13, it would be just simply a theological way of honoring our fathers and mothers. That's one of the 10 commandments. And so we're just trying to apply that to theology. So number two would be because we stand on the shoulders of giants to reach higher. If we don't do retrieval, we're constantly reinventing the wheel. We're constantly having to stand on our own 2 feet without the help of those in the past to where we can reach much higher. I think that's pretty straightforward. And then thirdly, and that's because Christians are not innovators. Throughout the history of the church, you'll find that there's a constant refrain of, I don't want to be an innovator. Innovators are the heretics. Innovators are the ones who are corrupting and destructive of the faith. And so Christians are the ones who trust the trustworthy sayings that have been handed down over time. They find the traditions that have been taught to us as worthy of following and developing. Now, not in the sort of man-made traditions that are corrupt, sort of quote unquote the popish ones, but the true Catholic and apostolic faith. So those are just a couple of ways why you should care about retrieval. And I know there's, should you just know a couple of quotes or versus knowing somebody's whole work? Well, obviously you want to know the person's whole work. But proof texting in and of itself is not wrong. It's wrong if it's contrary to what the person actually was communicating. But if you find quotes that are good and useful, abstracted from their context, but they're true and they are representative of what that person thought, I think that's just fine. So why bring up the topic of retrieval other than to just cover briefly what is retrieval, why it matters? That in and of itself is a valuable thing. But recently I saw someone say on the internet, and you know what, the internet, people are like, well, it's not real life. Well, it is real life because people are just saying what they actually think there, just as if somebody put something in a newspaper in old times when we didn't have the internet. That's real life too. Yes, it can be more volatile and toxic sometimes, but that's just the way life can be. So I saw this, somebody, Chris Bolt said this, he said, the so-called Protestant Retrieval Project always struck me as a group of tweeds nerding out over dead guys' nuanced abstract theological commitments nobody in the pews really cared about, while detesting what they had to say about more pressing sociological concerns of the day. And so I think this is a ridiculous tweet for a couple of reasons. I have nothing against Chris, but I think this is a ridiculous tweet, and that's fine. People should be able to disagree fairly and straightforwardly and directly. I think that's an appropriate mode of engagement for Christians. Directly disagree, no imputing of motives, no imputing of personal character, just saying, I 100% disagree, or I fairly disagree with some aspects here. In this case, I think I pretty much mostly disagree. So a couple of reasons why I disagree with this, because I think, well, let me just go through a couple of things, a couple of notes I jotted down. Number one, I honestly don't really understand the whole tweed thing. So I went back and I Googled again because I think there was like this sociological sort of, here's where different people go based on their interests and stuff. And I had been thinking tweed as in just normal intellectual guy, but I guess it turns out it's sort of like an intellectual guy plus left-leaning politics somehow. I don't remember the exact axis. I'm not sure. I'm not talking about the tweed stuff. I think that's irrelevant. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's relevant. Maybe. So I guess he's not talking about all the people that I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of Protestant retrieval projects, because obviously I don't think the Protestant retrieval projects are a bunch of liberals or whatever it is. But most oftentimes it's not a lot of people who know anything about politics. But let's set that aside. I think if this statement is true, that it's a bunch of people caring about what dead guys thought about these theological commitments that nobody in the pews actually cares about, I think we have a serious problem, because that means they don't care about God. And that is indeed deeply troubling, because what these Protestant retrieval projects in large part are trying to do is retrieve the beauty and the depth of our doctrine of God and of our Christology and of our theological heritage that goes to the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, these things that are fundamental to the faith once delivered to all the saints. And so if indeed the people in the pew don't care about these things, we have a serious problem. It's not the state that will save you. It is God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I know Chris isn't going to deny that, but I think what he's saying here seems to be very deeply troubling to me based upon these things. I mean, I think theological commitments, whether abstract or not, about God and Christ are of first importance, and I don't apologize for that. I think it's natural and good for people to want to spend more time dwelling and thinking about God and Christ than they do social concerns. And the reality is, people are finite. So they can't address everything. They can't always address all of the pressing sociological concerns. And we need people who are not doing that, who are committed to solely exploring and thinking about God. I don't want my pastor to be knowing every little social detail. I want him to be thinking, meditating upon the word, to be loving his people, to be at the hospital with them while they're dying, while they're sick. I don't want him to take his time thinking about whatever is going on the internet constantly. I want him to be singularly devoted to knowing Christ and him crucified. That is what I want him to be interested in. Do social things matter? Yes. That doesn't mean to devalue them. It just means to properly place them in the hierarchy of importance. And of course, we all agree that there should be a hierarchy of importance things. I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. Things with the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed should be of first importance. The gospel, the nature of the gospel is of first importance. And I do think another point why this tweet is wrong is because pressing sociological concerns are actually part of the Protestant Retrieval project. Have we not read any of those who are doing work in natural law, who are doing work in social thought, Protestant social thought? I mean, IVF, abortion, natural law, transhumanism, all these things. I think maybe what Chris is thinking is he actually doesn't know these people who are doing this great and good work that is out there, because those are pressing sociological concerns of this day. I do think also that just simply not everything needs to be on the internet. Well, I guess detest what they had to say about more pressing sociological concerns. I don't see anybody detesting stuff. Detesting makes no sense. But even if they didn't say something publicly, that's okay. That should be okay. The most important location for these pressing sociological concerns are in private spheres. They're in the local church. They're in their families. They're in their local communities. They're not on Facebook or Twitter. That's okay, and that's good. That's healthy in the right ordering of where you're spending your time and your resources. YouTube even these videos that I'm making here. I think the good old-fashioned way of addressing pressing sociological concerns is through local communities, in person. Yes, I think you need to say things and I think this is commensurate with somebody's online presence. If they're online all the time talking about everything under the sun, but not this, that is telling. If they're not regularly online, then it should not be a problem that they don't address every pressing sociological concern online. That should be expected. They have a life. Now, maybe there is a sense in which somebody's online a decent amount, but they only talk about X, Y, Z. They don't talk about these other things. Well, people are finite. They don't know everything, and they're not going to always address things that they're not fully confident in explaining appropriately. And there is the reality that we're talking about academics talking in academic speech to other academics. We should expect them to be discussing things in these abstract ways. And then in their classrooms and in their churches, they're explaining it in the more lower tier way. So we can't fault people for doing academics in academic context. That's silly. Most of these people are doing this work in their churches. So what are the objections to this? I think the ones that I've seen anyway, maybe there'll probably be more objections that I don't address here that you'll see on the internet if this thing continues to be a discussion. Number one, I think I've seen some people saying that the problem is that these academic guys are LARPing, and I don't know what they're LARPing for exactly. To be an academic, which they are, irrelevant. They're LARPing, and they're ultimately trying to bury the practical relevance of these sociological concerns and just discuss these things that don't make anybody mad. So it's not merely being academic, but being solely academic in order to hide it. But academic discourse, again, by its very nature, is difficult and precise, and so it will be obtuse and abstract, and that's okay because that's its purpose. You need someone at be doing those things, and you need people to filter it down. That's okay. Not everybody's a great filter downer to explain it to normal people, and that's all right. Not everybody's gifted at everything. And most of these people, again, are in their churches and their local communities saying these things. But people just assume they're not because they don't know any better, and it's fun to have a villain and a scapegoat. It's fun to crucify someone. But the reality is, I don't know who these people are that are trying to hide these things. Who are they? Give me some names. Objection two, maybe, is the buddy system and hiding. Again, so I think this is somewhat similar. And it's not that the people never seem to address pressing social concerns, it's that they never do it publicly. And then they'll turn around and be buddy buddy with somebody who is on the wrong side of social issues, whether it be LGBTQ stuff or whatever. And you're thinking, well, they're working with them in other areas, Trinitarian areas, whatever else, but they're not, but they're just silent on these other matters. So, for example, I've seen a lot of criticism of Matthew Barrett for his classical Trinitarianism book, having somebody like Amy Peeler in that volume, because I don't know. I don't exactly remember what everybody doesn't like her for. I don't remember her being pro LGBTQ. I don't think she is. Nor do I see a problem collaborating on certain sorts of projects, even with people who you disagree with deeply, even on matters of social matters. I don't think that's problematic. That's just a right ordering of theological importance. You should be able to work with different people in the areas of agreement. Like if you understand, you agree with the Apostles' Creed, you agree with the Nicene Creed, you should be able to collaborate on matters that relate to that, even if you disagree deeply on secondary, third tier, whatever other issues, even 1.5 tier issues. I think you should be able to collaborate, depending on the context. Academic books, yeah, that's just kind of the purpose and the nature of those books, and people need to understand that. Those are not. People need to understand the purpose of books and the roles of books. I'm not going to explain everything. So I think fundamentally here, it seems that the logic is in new clothes, essentially, is that silence is violence. If you're not speaking publicly, then you're part of the problem. If you're not constantly tweeting about whatever the topic is, then you're the problem. Or if you're nice to people who disagree with you, even with an ounce, but it's on some important issue, then you're the problem. And I think that's juvenile and silly and is just, juvenile is an appropriate word. We should be able to be adults and understand how to properly triage different doctrinal issues, properly triage different practical issues. And we should also understand that not everybody has to constantly talk about everything. That's okay. There is reason and real frustration with certain people who have public platforms who speak about everything but then don't speak about X, Y, Z. I get that. But that's far and few between, I think, at least in the circles that I run in, the circles that I am aware of. Because I saw, I responded to this tweet from Chris with just LOL, because I think it's a deeply silly tweet that just is wrong. And it's written in, Chris does this often, he knows it. He writes things in such a way that he is implying certain things, but then can sort of walk it back and say, well, that's not what I meant. That's not what I said. I didn't explicitly say that. That's you reading things into the text, which I think, so he can kind of have it both ways, where he can imply something without getting in trouble for it. But I replied to him with just that, because I think it's too silly to warrant a response on Twitter where that's the sole purpose of that is inflammatory rhetoric. And then, somebody replied to me sort of like, this is talking about you, people like you. And I'm like, me? Because I like to think deeply about Christology and the doctrine of God. I don't care about matters of pressing social concern. I've written essays on gender. I've given talks on gender. I've done podcasts on gender and other things like that of grave pressing social concern. I don't fully understand that. Retrieval is important. I'm not playing this game where you have to say exactly whatever the tribal party wants, whatever the anons on social media want. This is not a matter of internet personalities who have anonymous accounts being able to judge how to properly engage our current social moment. I don't really care what the anonymous accounts on Twitter say. They're too afraid to show their face. So now and the reality is everybody's going to be condemned at the end of this. I'm just not going to play that game. And so fundamentally what I'm trying to say here is that retrieval is good. Retrieval matters and it's important. And despite what other people might tell you, the faults of retrieval, yes, there are faults in it. Some people are too much into repersonation. Some people are too much into being really, really creative. So you got like the two ends of the spectrum where you can kind of like fall off the edge. And sometimes retrieval can appear overly academic, But you need overly academic stuff, but you also need the sort of popular level retrieval. And these are good things. And we should care about retrieving God in Christ before we care about retrieving social concerns. Moral theology, moral virtue is incredibly important and valuable. Natural law, all these things should be retrieved and should be dealt with and should be continually developed and pressed in public forums in all sorts of different ways. But at the end of the day, like the weird rhetoric against retrieval for whatever reason is silly. I mean, there's a whole host of people who also thought COVID was weird. COVID has broken people's brains, apparently. Being able to judge appropriately and to make fair judgments and say, you know what, not everybody is, people make mistakes, but also the reality that they can't see that some people didn't make mistakes. They just assume that they did because they're on the wrong team for whatever it is. So hopefully this wasn't too much of a sociological episode in and of itself, but I hope to sometimes in these sort of episodes and that I do in these videos, I want to address matters of concern to my audience, those who regularly listen to me, that touch on the topics that I'm interested in, that I'm equipped to be able to answer appropriately. So maybe I will do some more social sort of topics in the future. I don't know. You tell me if you want me to talk about something. I'm happy to do that. I've been asked to write more and more on moral theology, and so I'm trying to read more and more on these areas so that I can be more and more equipped to make helpful, useful arguments to serve the Christian faith, to defend Orthodox Christianity and all of its claims in whole, theologically related, and I want to do that well. So that's what I've got to say here. Let me know what you think. Did I miss anything? Do you disagree with anything? No offense. Like, it's cool to disagree with me. That's great. I'm not flawless. I am imperfect, and I'm constantly growing. So I'm always learning from you all, especially the comments. Sometimes I just laugh. Sometimes I just disagree, and sometimes I learn. So go ahead and drop a comment. I appreciate it. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I look forward to thinking with you soon.